I am so glad Zen 4 is out because these takes are getting ridiculous. Guys, this is getting out of hand. I think something about the last 2 years has broken you. It's happened to a lot of people, don't be embarrassed, unless you're this guy.
Now, what makes this a little bit different is on the desktop side, we've never had a 103 die launched before. So in reality, the 103 is really just the 104. They just changed the name. And then what they're calling the AD104 is really an AD106. So a lot of people would say that it's even a 4060 class GPU. And in reality, that one is not wrong.
But you're not doing your audiences any favors right now. As I said in my last video, I think this ongoing message that NVIDIA is trying to gouge the customer by rebranding a 4070 as a 4080 and then jacking up the price is misleading. Like that time they told us inflation was transitory, or that more people wanted to see Morbius, or that we shouldn't pay scalper prices for Ampere or Navi GPUs. We'll come back to that one. This is really a problem of perspective and twisted incentives. The perspective problem is clear. The consensus is that NVIDIA created the 4080 with 16 gigs, and then they looked at the market and said, "Fuck it, these guys will pay anything," and jacked up the price to a totally unreasonable $1,200, and then filled the gap by renaming the already spec'd 4070. Done and done. Forgive me, but this is a stupid take. I know, I'm new here. I clearly have no credibility to call the consensus stupid, but here we are. NVIDIA is an enormous company with global operations and over 20,000 employees, and more than a few of those employees are pricing specialists, and they're the ones that are looking for a win after consecutive launch failures. Yes, both Turing and Ampere were pricing failures, and NVIDIA can't afford to play around with their consumers now that AMD has been delivering consistent gains. When the RTX 2080 was released in 2018, AMD had tried and failed with both Polaris and Vega to match NVIDIA's flagships, and there was no reason to believe that Navi would be able to compete. Plus, NVIDIA was bringing ray tracing and DLSS, which AMD still can't compete with. Add to that the way Intel had been ruling the CPU market, and you had a perfect situation for NVIDIA to test the upper limits of the market's price sensitivity. And it was a legendary throw. Sales down 45% year over year. It was so bad that the price for the 1080 Ti increased, sometimes to $1,000. Reviewers almost universally recommended the 1080 and the 1080 Ti over the 2070 and 2080.
So my current recommendation at this current time is a big fat don't buy.
Then AMD dropped the 5000 series and severely screwed up their already failed pricing strategy. So, come 2020, they knew they couldn't make the same mistake again. They needed to get back in gamers' good graces, so they delivered massive performance gains and kept prices the same for the 3070 and 3080. They even snuck in a little change to their tier architecture of the 3080 to stack the deck in their favor, and it was a slightly less legendary throw. As I pointed out in the last video, things cost what they cost. NVIDIA underpriced their product to look pro-consumer, and it backfired. Inventory disappeared almost immediately, and product reappeared on the secondary market at what appeared to be scalpers' prices. Fortunately for NVIDIA, they didn't take the heat from the gaming community. That all fell on resellers and miners, but they certainly got it from their board and from their shareholders. To be clear, this was NVIDIA's fault, and they paid the biggest price for it. While consumers had to pay higher prices, typically 50 to 100% in the first 3 months after launch, that all happened in reseller markets, meaning that they were real market prices. That likely means that if NVIDIA had set their prices 40 to 60% higher, they would still have sold through their inventory, and that profit would have come to them. Not only that, but those higher initial prices would have reduced the incentive for resellers, and more product would have been directly purchased by gamers. Yes, miners would have been buying too, but those higher prices would have affected their decisions. More cards would have been on the shelves, albeit at somewhat higher prices, and you wouldn't be paying $300 for an R9 290X on eBay in 2021. But tier pricing wasn't the real big mistake that NVIDIA made with Ampere. Let's talk about that truly silly 4070 snark. We've been hearing a lot about the fact that the 4080 12GB is using an AD104 die, which should obviously classify it as a 70 series. See, look, the 3080 uses a GA102 and the 3070 a GA104. But remember that little change I mentioned that was in the 3080? Yeah, that was it. If you look at the previous 80 series GPUs since 2014, they've all used an 04 die except for the 3080. What does that mean? It means last generation they bumped up the 3080 and 3070 to deliver a stepped up die at each tier. It was the anomaly. They created overspec'd and underpriced products that supercharged demand and helped lead to the last 2 years of absurd prices while enriching resellers and leaving consumers in the cold. So with Lovelace, they returned to their normal pattern and designed an 80 series with a 104 die. So why the uproar? Isn't a return to normal something we all want right now? I honestly don't know. I have a hard time believing that people like Jay's 2 cents who've been doing this for so long just miss this. So what's the play? In Jay's defense, he did point out at the end of a recent video that the naming isn't that important.
I feel like it's my duty, obviously, to let the audience know, like, hey, you either care about what it's called or you don't. Because reality is, I did see comments on some of these posts about the 4080 thing saying, I don't give a crap what it's called as long as the price to performance is there and makes sense. We haven't benchmarked these yet. The 4080 12 gig being called a 4080 or 4070 at $900, if it performs really, really well, might not matter at the end of the day. It's just about the optics of what it looks like the company's trying to do to the consumer.
But he's still pushing this 4070 message, and it's just bogus. If the history of 04 dies and 80 series cards isn't enough, have a look at this. This is a chart of what basically everyone has been talking about. In blue is the core count for each 70, 80, and 90 series products since 2014. You can see here that the 4080 12 gig has fewer cores than the 3080 by about 10% and is priced $200 higher. The 16 gig has about 11% more cores than the 3080, so must be the true 4080, and the smaller 12 gig is just a price-jacked 4070. But this is the wrong chart. It's focused on meaningless numbers when it should be focused on performance. Remember when we learned that pure clock speed and core count isn't the determining factor in CPU performance? Here's the chart we should be looking at. In green is the performance of each card relative to the previous generation's 80 Ti. The last 2 entries are based on NVIDIA's announcement, so obviously will change a bit after independent tests come out. Notice 2 things. First, the horizontal line represents a 15% improvement over the previous 80 Ti. What's above that line? Only 80 plus cards, with the exception of the 1070 Ti, which had 27% more cores than the 1070 and was essentially a price drop for the 1080, delivering 96% of its performance at $200 less. Every 70 series card, including the latest, delivers at most a 14% improvement over the previous 80 Ti. So based on die naming, it's legitimately an 80 series, and if NVIDIA's performance numbers are in any way realistic, it's in a class with the 3090 Ti in terms of generational improvement. I mean, look at what Jay had to say about the less than 40% improvement of the 3080 over the 2080 Ti.
The common thing you also heard people say was, just wait for the 2nd gen RTX cards. Behold, your savior, the 3080. It's insane how they're able to get this much extra performance. And I found myself going, holy crap, 30% more at $400 less? My brain can't handle this. And then I dropped the real bombshell when I told Phil, I'm doing this wrong. You guys tell me that all the time. But I'm doing this wrong because I'm comparing it to a 2080 Ti. The story here is the way it compares to a 2080. That was an $800 card when it launched. That's an $800 card now. This is up to 90% faster at 0% more money.
The more I look at it, the more I think they messed it up again. They should have released these as the 4080, 4080 Ti, and Titan L for something like $1799. That would have left plenty of room for a 4090 and 4090 Ti, and the performance claims for the 4080 would have been right on target. But that doesn't absolve the community for this trash take that it's really a 4070. Let's not forget the advice the online tech community gave to gamers in 2020 and 2021. Shortly after Ampere was released and the stock disappeared, the universal advice was to not pay scalper prices. I'm glad I was smart enough to ignore that. I bought a 2080 Super for my wife for $650 new and a 3070 off Craigslist for myself for $675. It turned out to be a great decision. The 2080 Super didn't fall back to that price until April of 2022, and the 3070 didn't fall back below $675 until a month later in May. But everyone who listened to that bad advice either had to part with more money, get a less powerful card, or wait 2 years until prices return to the original MSRP, which is still an inflated price because no hardware should be at MSRP 2 years after release. But here's where the twisted incentive comes in. This is just a bandwagon jump, and the easiest one of all time. Everybody hates that things are more expensive, but they are. But when you're a consumer advocate, it's a cheap and easy win to accuse a multinational of scamming or squeezing or gouging the customer. Look out, the big bad corporation is trying to eat you. It was the same with scalpers in 2020. They can point to some easily hated enemy and direct all your anger and disappointment on them, so you're left feeling some warm fuzzies to your ally on the screen. But when the advice they give you is actually harmful, costing you money when you pay more inflated prices, performance when you have to buy a lesser GPU, or time when you're forced to wait 2 years to upgrade, they pay no price for it. You keep coming back because they really care about you and will tell you who's out to get you. I'm not saying that they don't care about their audiences, but if this 4070 idea takes root, there will be consequences, and it won't be our favorite tech personalities who have to suffer them. So here's some different advice. Ignore the name. Ignore the core count. Pay attention to the performance. If benchmarks show that it really delivers 2x performance over a 3080 Ti, then it's worth at least $900 regardless of the size of the die. Or, if like the 2080 it just barely matches performance, then pass, or buy AMD, or wait for prices to drop. But don't get upset because they price their product to market. There's a grain of truth to the 4070 meme that I hate to admit to, except that nobody's talking about it. They're all talking about die size and core counts and the performance delta between the 12 and 16 gig variants, when they should be focusing on performance overall. Let's take a look again at our chart of relative performance compared to the previous generation's 80 Ti. The 15% line represents a fair division between upper and mid-tier cards, and if independent benchmarks show that the performance charts presented by NVIDIA at GTC represent the actual performance of the 4080 12GB, then there is a case to be made that is actually a 4070. The 3090 Ti shown in the charts represents about a 9% improvement over the 3080 Ti. So if the 4080 12GB is in that class of performance, then it would represent a less than 10% improvement over its previous generation 80 Ti. The main problem is that while this does seem to be a fair division between upper and mid-tier cards, of the last 4 generations, only 2 of the 80 series cards were above the line. Both the 980 and the 2080 gave less than 15% improvement over the previous generation's 80 Ti, which means even with this test in mind, the 4080 12GB would still qualify as an 80 series card. And here's a bonus chart showing the change in transistors and L2 cache from the 970 through the 4080. You'll notice a massive increase from 6 megabytes of L2 cache in the 3090 Ti to 48 in the 4080 12GB. If you're wondering about the value of the L2 cache, Tom's Hardware said in March that testing on AMD's RDNA 2 architecture showed that huge caches can basically eliminate GPU bottlenecks. You'll also notice a 25% increase in transistors from the 3090 Ti and a 100% increase in transistors from the 3070 to the 4080 12GB. So now that that's out of the way, please stop with the meme. It wasn't clever to begin with, and it's even worse now. Tell me what you think in the comments below, and thanks for watching.